Hello, everybody. I'm Kevin Allen, and I'm joined by my podcast partner, Bob Duff, and this is the HockeyDebates.com podcast. We come to you twice a week, and we talk all things hockey, although there's been a little less hockey during this pandemic. But today we have a special guest, and he is an NBC broadcaster, lead announcer, Mike Emrick. You know him. He's been doing the broadcast of all the Stanley Cup finals for a number of years. I've kind of lost track. Mike, how many years have you been doing that?
I think it's around 20 or so total. There were some ESPN years in there and Sports Channel America and now NBC.
Well, the reason we have Mike on, we're going to ask him a little bit about what he's been doing during the pandemic, obviously, and also get his thoughts on what he thinks will happen. Of course, we're all guessing, but we'll get Mike to give his guess on what'll happen. But I want to talk a little bit because I have, and full disclosure, I have a vested interest in this because I helped Mike with his book. He did a book that's coming out in the fall, and it's basically his life story. And what I found to had the most fun with is that my roots, even though I was not born there, are in Indiana. A lot of my relatives, my mother was from there, my father was from there. A lot of my relatives still live there. And what a lot of people don't realize is that here's Mike Emrick, who is the most well-known broadcaster in the United States, who comes from Indiana, which is basketball crazed. In fact, that's in the title of the book, how a boy from basketball crazed Indiana ended up being USA's number one broadcaster. But Mike, can you explain how in the world from Indiana, where they had no, back when you were growing up, had no real NHL presence, would end up where you are today?
Well, I saw my first game live, and I think that's the thing that hooks people on this sport is you see a game live and you get totally enamored with it and you become a fanatic about it. And up until the time I saw my first game live, which was December 14th, 1960, in Fort Wayne with Muskegon, I wanted to be a baseball announcer. I realized at a very young age, and Bob probably didn't because he's still playing goal. I realized I wasn't going to be much of an athlete. And so I wanted to become a broadcaster because I was a radio fanatic that would listen to baseball broadcasts in the afternoon on a Chicago station because there were no lights at Wrigley Field then. And at night, all these Clear Channel stations that on the AM dial that had Pittsburgh and Philadelphia and St. Louis and Cleveland, you could listen to baseball all evening. So up until the time I saw that first IHL game, I wanted to be a baseball announcer, and then it was hockey. And the question is, and there's no short answer for this, how do you wind up becoming a hockey announcer from rural Indiana? And it's sitting in the Coliseum in Fort Wayne and doing games to yourself into a tape recorder and sending them out and getting people to listen to your work. And eventually, after all that persistence, somebody gives you a job in the IHL for $160 a week. And that was the most money I'd ever seen in my life. It was great. That was 47 years ago.
I'm going to let you know a little secret, Mike. If you're willing to play goal, if you're foolish enough to stand in front of the puck, they'll always let you play because they're always looking for guys that are that dumb. So that's one of the reasons why there's a lot of old goalies in the world, because most people get smart enough to realize this is really stupid what I'm doing here.
So that's what thing. He said that the reason he became a goaltender was he was the youngest one on an outdoor rink and nobody would play goal. So they threw him in. And after about a year of doing that, he got to where he liked it. And of course, that became his profession.
And I think there's a lot of little brother stories in goalies. I had an older brother and he needed someone to shoot pucks at in the driveway. So as long as I was willing to stand there, I got to play. You talk about the IHL and starting out there. And I had a young fella just graduated from college come to me a few years ago and asked me if I could give him some advice on getting into the sports journalism and sports broadcasting world. And I said, well, Dick Beddoes, who I'm sure you both remember a long time ago, I wrote to him when I was in college, and he wrote me back, and his advice was just get your foot in the door. It doesn't matter where it is. He started out, I think it was in Leduc, Alberta, at a newspaper there. And then by the time I got to know him, he was the lead hockey writer at the Globe and Mail, had his own TV show, and was kind of one of the biggest journalists in Toronto when I was growing up. But this is the same advice I gave to this fellow, and he said, "No, I want to be on Sportsnet right away. I want to be on SportsCenter right away." And I said, "You know what? When I was 22 years old, I thought I was ready to cover the NHL too. And you know what else? I was wrong. I went out to Saskatoon and I covered junior hockey for 4 years, and I learned how to do the job and how to build relationships and sources and all that sort of stuff, and got to meet wonderful people that I still have relationships today with, people like Wendell Clark and Todd McClellan and Marcel Como, Dennis Bayak, lots of people that I've known for, going on close to 40 years now. And I still cherish those memories. That was so much fun. It was obviously a different era, but I'm sure you probably feel the same way about the time you spent in those IHL cities.
Exactly. And I wouldn't trade those years for anything, even though you would think that riding buses for 7 years and having 14-hour bus rides from Port Huron to Des Moines, or 14-hour bus rides from Portland, Maine to Halifax would be not romantic at all. But you're absolutely right. That's where you really learn a lot about the sports and a lot about developing those relationships that wind up being so important to you in later years. There's no magic overnight tool to success. I believe it was, I'm trying to remember now who it was that said, you work hard for 18 years to become an overnight success in hockey. And I think that was probably the truest words that were ever spoken. You do wind up doing that. And maybe that's the thing that looks so attractive to young people coming into it. They just don't realize the sacrifice that you have to make when you're breaking in. And that's one of the real gems that I think Kevin brought to me too. I had tried to write a book for 8 years. I couldn't organize a thing. I had all of these stories and all of these things I'd collected from my years of riding the buses and working for the Beaver County Times in Western Pennsylvania for nothing. Because, as you said, Bob, I wanted to get my foot in the door. So I covered the Pittsburgh Penguins for 1 year for free. I was a member of the National Hockey League Writers Association. Didn't make a dime. Didn't get to vote that year either, but I covered the Penguins, and Red Kelly was the coach. I covered them for a year, and boy, was that ever valuable. I lost a lot of money on gas and parking and everything else doing it, but what an experience it was. And it got my foot in the door because I got to meet a lot of people.
Mike, I wanted to ask you, since you and I both started in the NHL in the 1980s, we both watched sort of how the game evolved, and it's really a different game. I mean, it looks the same, but it's not. I mean, the way we do things, the emphasis on defense, sophistication of the training, how fast people skate, how hard they shoot the puck, all of that has really changed dramatically. And I know that I've had to sort of adjust as a writer to, the changes of the game and what's important to fans, and is different now than what was important then. I wonder if you had any changes in broadcasting that's come about because you saw the game a little bit differently today than you did in the 80s.
Yeah, it's a shorter game. It's 2 hours and 25 minutes now. And sometimes, why am I smiling? Sometimes the game used to go 3 hours or a little longer. We still have this, don't we? 1x3, 5 ounces or a little more, but so much of the rest has changed. There was a program on that I saw recently, Ken Burns doing an historical thing on country music, and he quoted one of the artists as saying, if you put your foot in the river twice, the river is different. And I think it's the same way with hockey. It's different now than it was. But if you expect it to be the same, then when you put in your foot in the river before, you're going to be a grumpy old man, and you're going to be scowling all the time. If you expect it to be the way it was, it has changed a lot. It is a different kind of game because it's shorter now. It's faster. The players are more skilled. They're bigger. You can measure it from 5'11", 185 when I first came in 1980, and you did, to the average size now is almost 6'2", and a little over 200 pounds. The players are just bigger. Are there as many fights? No, there are not. There's protective gear now. Almost 100% of the players wear visors. And the fighting is a lot different now. It's a little more dangerous if you get in a fight because the players are stronger and the crashing blows, and we know so much more now. about the damage that can be done in fights. So the game has changed a lot that way. But it is a thrilling game, and the league has demographics to show that there are a lot of young people that love it that never saw the days when every other shift would have a fight. And bench clears have been eliminated for now. What, since 1988 was the last year that we even had one. They have them in baseball a lot, but we don't have them in hockey anymore. So the game is tremendously different. How does that make my job different? The game is faster than it was. And so you just have to be sharper at picking up names, because those are the legs that get us from, in our play-by-play, from one player to the next, is picking up names and numbers. And I will always say that when you have a sleeve here and on this side that is 4 inches, and you are 200 feet away, and that is a two-tone number because that jersey looked really good in a vice president's office, but he didn't bother to see whether that was going to look good from a press box or from a paying customer's seat 2 tiers away. Sometimes we have difficulty in picking up those numbers. And if you're waiting to look for the number on the back of a player's jersey, that player is going to be in the American League next week, because they're supposed to go east to west. They're not supposed to turn their backs to you that much. So those are the things that we have as challenges now. But it's still a wonderful game. It's faster. We have to be more alert to those kinds of things. And the days when guys would blast shots off the wing and beat goaltenders, those are done. It's the most coached position. The equipment is much better. You don't beat many goaltenders with big blasts off the wing anymore. Anybody can call hard drives from 40 feet that go into the net. Almost everything now gets a tip.
We've seen a couple during this shutdown of North American sports. I know Joe Buck's been doing some play-by-play of people's lives on Twitter. The favorite one I've seen, though, is from a BBC announcer named Andrew Cotter. If you haven't seen it, you got to look for it. It's 2 dogs having a dispute over a rubber chew toy, and his commentary, it's like watching the English announcers who do golf. It's just so brilliantly subtle. And look for it, because if you haven't seen it, it's wonderful. But has anybody asked you to do a play-by-play of their life experiences during this shutdown, Mike?
Not anything like that, Bob. I did do one of 4 dogs, including 2 of ours. They wait at the gate to tear into a second yard that is an exercise yard. And so I did a dog race that was a 10-meter sprint, and one of the dogs left the track. And so it was left up to the race stewards to determine who the winner was, because it had to be reviewed. And there was one that actually, of all things, had over 200,000 views. It was my mechanic. The last day before the state of Michigan got shut down, I went for an oil change, and he did replace a windshield wiper, and so I did play-by-play of that. But those are fun things to do, because we're all looking for something to occupy our time. But honestly, Kevin has been very patient, because he's done 15, 16 books, and I've only done one outside of a checkbook. And he's been very patient with me, because our deadline was the 31st of March, and that has taken up an awful lot of my time.
Well, Mike, we kind of run out of time for you, but we appreciate you taking time to drop in and talk to us. I got to ask you, though, do you have any guess on what will happen this summer? I mean, over the last Friday, we heard Pierre LeBrun say that there's been discussion of 5-game playoff rounds, except for the final, and maybe a regular season resuming in June. I know nobody knows, but do you think we're going to play hockey this summer?
I don't know. Here's what you would know, and you guys know this well too, that on 6th Avenue, they have plans B, C, D, and E, and it all depends on how soon that we get back. One thing that they have stated is sacrosanct is the start of next year, which would be in October. So the later we go, the less chance we have of playing. So let's hope. But the one thing that is that all efforts are going to be made to protect the players and to protect the arena personnel, and if we have fans, to protect them too. These are all statements of the obvious, something that I have become very good at over 47 years. a tremendous grasp of the obvious.
Yeah, that's all of it.
I hope we play, but only in its own time.
Well, Mike, we appreciate you stopping. And as we mentioned, Mike has a book coming out in the fall. It's called Off Mike, and it'll be available on Amazon. And I had an enjoyable time doing it. I think Mike did too, reminiscing about all the stories. So I'll make sure you look for that in the fall. So thanks for joining us, Mike.
Thanks,
and here for you, Bob.
If I go right by me.
All right. All right, that was Mike Emrick joining us to talk about his upcoming book and reminisce a little bit about his career. And the thing about Mike, when you listen to his broadcast, is he comes across like such a nice guy who just loves the game, and that's exactly how he is. Like I don't know that you're ever going to find like a nicer guy than Mike Emrick. We both Mike and I at different times worked in Port Huron, Michigan. I worked for the newspaper there, and he started his career as a broadcaster doing the Port Huron Flags and the IHL. And we sort of bonded on our time. And Mike still lives out in that area. He doesn't live in Port Huron, but he lives in that area. And of course, I still live in Michigan. So both of us are national guys that ended up staying in Michigan because we liked it so well. But I don't know. I think I don't. There's a lot of really good Canadian broadcasters, Bob, but because he's been my guy in the United States for so long, to me, he's the voice I think about when I think about hockey broadcast in America.
Yeah, he's kind of what to American hockey fans, what Foster Hewitt and Danny Gallivan were to Canadian fans. Like, he's the voice, for most American hockey fans, he's the voice who grew up hearing calling hockey. And that's the way I always looked at, the Hewitts and Danny Gallivan. They were the people that were calling the game on my TV when I was growing up and falling in love with the game.
Yeah, absolutely. Bob, I wanted to talk about a couple of sad stories, but number one, because I know you know him well, Tom Webster passed away. And, this is a guy that played in both the NHL and WHA and was a coach and, played. And I'll have a story after Bob does about playing with, Gordie Howe, rooming with him when he was with the Red Wings. He also played with them the WHA. But I know you've got a few stories about him. And what I was always struck by, and I'd like you to kind of address this because you know him better than I did, is, he was kind of explosive as a coach, and yet when you talk to him, he was very mild-mannered. Like his persona as a coach to me seemed different than when you talk to him, when he just was a nice storyteller, and he didn't seem to be all that fiery, when you talk to him. But when you watch him coach, he seemed to be a guy that could be a little explosive.
Yeah, I was living in Windsor and working in Windsor. One of the joys of covering hockey is you get the best of both worlds. I got to cover the NHL with the Red Wings on one side of the border, and I could still cover junior hockey with the Spitfires in Windsor. And so you're still in that development stage where you get to know a lot of players as they're on their way up to the NHL and build a relationship with them that would last for years. And Tommy had 2 long stints in Windsor and actually was the second or third person I ever interviewed when I was hired by the Windsor Star, because the first assignment they gave me was to go do a Spitfire playoff game that night. And it ended up going to double overtime. And the fellow who scored the goal was a guy named Paul Hampton. So naturally I talked to him. Then I talked to Adam Graves, and then I believe Tommy was next. So Tommy and I were basically acquaintances from the moment I set foot in Windsor until he retired and really moved away from the area after he left the Flames, where his last job was working in the front office with the Flames. But you're right. He definitely had a switch. When game time rolled around, the intensity in Tommy just changed. Like he ramped it up significantly. And, there's a lot of guys like that, are the greatest guys in the world. And he certainly was. I still have fond memories of riding the buses with the Spitfires and just sitting and listening to Tommy tell stories and talk about his grasp of the game and the little insights he had. Like, I remember one time we were heading up to Kingston for a Spitfire game, and some of the young players were walking around with their shirts off and they were flexing their muscles. And Tommy just kind of shook his head and laughed. And he said, those guys don't have a clue what conditioning is. Wait till they get to their first pro camp. They think they're in shape now. They don't know what they're talking about. But I think my favorite Tom Webster story was the first time he ever got called up. He started in the Boston Bruins organization. And he got called up from Oklahoma City to play for the Bruins. And they had a practice the first day up. And they're doing a shooting drill. And he's coming in and he's shooting against Jerry Cheevers. And he said, take my first shot right by him. Come back in the second time, give him another move, right by him again. And this went on like 3, 4, 5 times. And I'm feeling real good about myself. I think, I'm an NHLer. I belong here. I'm scoring on one of the best goalies in the league. He can't touch my shot. And he said, then I started really paying attention. And I noticed that everybody was scoring on Cheevers on every shot. He was literally moving out of the way of the puck. Jerry Cheevers was one of those guys whose theory was you only had so many saves and you why waste them in practice. He even felt that way in 8-1 games. Why should I take a Bobby Hull shot in the head in an 8-1 game? I'll let him score. So it kind of he dawned on him that he wasn't maybe as good as he thought he was.
It's a great story. When we were talking about that switch, it just sort of reminded me of that he was kind of like that. And I think he, after a game when he had kind of calmed down, not right after a game, but a little later on when he had calmed down, he probably didn't even understand why he got so worked up. But it's like what Ron Burgundy, the famed from Anchorman, would say, that escalated quickly. And then that's how it would with Tom Webster. It just would get out of hand when he'd get fired up. But the story I always remember, he roomed with Gordie Howe when he was a rookie. And they just stuck him with him as sort of a mentoring thing. And he went up to the room, and Gordie wasn't there. And as soon as he walked in the room, the phone rang. And they were looking for Gordie. And he said, well, Gordie's not here. He said, may I take a message? And the guy said, yeah, have him call, whoever it was. And he gave him a number. And Tom said, I repeated the number to make sure I got it correctly because, I didn't want to get it wrong for Gordie. And so he put the phone down. And as soon as I put it in the cradle, it rang again. And is Gordie Howe there? And I said, well, no, but I'll take a message. And the guy said, okay, it's so-and-so. And he gave me his number. I repeated it, make sure. He said, I used my best handwriting. I had it down. And he said, before I know it, I had taken 40, 50 calls. And I got all sorts of numbers. He said, I took each one down carefully. And I got just a stack of paper. And Gordie finally comes in and he goes, Gordie, a lot of people called for you, but I took every number down. And so I hand him a stack of paper. He looks at it, throws it in the trash, and said, it's game day. I don't really call people back on game day. Anyway, but he said that was when he understood what being a pro is that Gordie was focused on hockey at hockey time, not about who was calling him in the, the middle of the day. So, yeah.
He told me a good Gordie story too. When he first was assigned to a room with him, he was just in awe because it's Gordie Howe. Here he is, basically still qualified as an NHL rookie, even though he played a few games for the Bruins. And he said his first couple of road trips, he couldn't get to sleep because he said he'd be just nodding off and he'd roll over and he'd look at the other bed and he'd go, holy smokes, that's Gordie Howe.
Yeah, he told me that too. I remember that story. Yeah. No, that's a shame. And, he's too young. He was only 71, Tom was, when he passed away. And, that is too young in these days. But he was a terrific hockey guy who had most people didn't recognize what a terrific hockey player he was as well. He had a good career as a player that came up at both and had both the WHA and the NHL. But I also wanted to talk about Colby Cave, obviously. Prime of his career. I don't know if there's anything you can even add to that. It's just the saddest story, a brain bleed, nobody's fault. The guy's the picture of health, and then it just never comes out of a medically induced coma. It's just heartbreaking to read what his wife had to say about him at the end. And I'm not even sure they got to their first anniversary. They hadn't been married that long, I don't think. But a very sad tale. And I think it's particularly shocking when these kind of things happen in the sports world, Bob, because, you're dealing with a lot of athletes who are just in peak physical condition. Like they just can't even entertain the idea that something like this could happen. And I wonder what the impact will be on the his teammates as they kind of have to deal with this and grieve at a time when they're all dealing with the pandemic and everything else.
And it's so sudden too. I mean, obviously the Flyers are dealing with the loss of their teammate too. He's off fighting cancer, but you get to see him. You still get
Right.
to be, around him and encourage him through his battle. This was just like in a blink of an eye, he was gone. You didn't get a chance to even say goodbye. And that's the only thing I can relate it to in my career was when I worked out in Western Canada. That was when the tragic Swift Current bus crash, when the 4 players were killed, and it something that still stays with me. And Scotty Kruger was one of the 4 players who was killed, and Scotty had played in Prince Albert the year before, and that Prince Albert was right by Saskatoon, so it was in our readership. And he was built like Nathan Gerby. He was a little guy, like 5'4", 5'5", and he was leading the league in scoring early in the season. So they sent me up there to do a big feature on him. This little guy, and that was in the 80s when nobody 5'5" got even a look for the NHL. And here's this little guy tearing up the league. So they sent me up there to do a story with him, and I got to know him pretty well. And then he went when Swift Current came in the next year. He went to there, which was his home, and he was playing well for them. And it just happened. Swift Current's last game before Christmas, the Christmas break, was in Saskatoon, and I just happened to be walking through the hallways. I'd done my interviews, was heading back up to the press box to write my story, and here came Scotty coming out to go to the bus, and we stopped and we chatted and wished each other happy holidays, and both went on our way. And first game back from Christmas was when the bus crashed and he was killed. So it just, there's a guy who was like 18, 19 years old, and he's gone in an instant.
Yeah, it's just so hard to even come to grips with that. And I did, before we go, I wanted to ask you a little bit about what came out last Friday. Pierre LeBrun, who is a very wired-in reporter, this is all accurate information, that there's been discussion about the fact that the league would like to play regular season games for a variety of reasons. But there's a fairness issue here. You came into the season expecting there was going to be 82, and there's teams fighting for a playoff spot. You want to give them their opportunity as well. And plus, it's almost like we've turned back the clock, Bob, where, when players come back, they're not going to be in shape. They haven't had the ability to work out like they normally would, where a modern player is almost always close to being in shape now. And there's no ice, there's nowhere to go. So they're talking about that. I talked to a bunch of people. I'm actually writing a column about all of this. And everyone believes that it'll be at least a 3-week training camp anyway. And then everyone believes that, we're going to need to play some games. We can't go right into the playoffs. Like that, it would be just too difficult because, you're going to have to shake off the cobwebs. They're going to have to get sort of in sync. So, then we'd have, 3 rounds of 5-game series and then 1 game of the final. And the hope you could start regular season in June, and then, maybe August and September, we could, have a pretty close to regular playoff. And as much as I want to see this, Bob, and I do, like I think we need sports as a diversion and everything else. I'm starting to say to myself, isn't this irresponsible? I mean, haven't we? I mean, I know they're going to work at making it as safe as possible, but I don't know that you can create a bubble where nobody will stray, and they're going to try to keep everyone sort of isolated so you can play without fans. And the NBA is going to try this too, but it just feels like somebody will go out, sneak out, and see friends, and then what are we going to test every week? Like, it just feels like this isn't the right thing to do. As much as I want it to be what we do, it doesn't seem like we should do it. Your thoughts?
Well, Sports Illustrated did a really good piece on just that topic last week, and just how illogical it is that this could actually work unless the virus is eradicated completely, because you're going to gather, they did it built around the theory, the baseball plan of playing in the spring training sites and keeping the players isolated, but they're still going to be living in hotels. Assuming the NHL does this neutral site thing they're talking about, the players are going to be housed in hotels. So who's to say, even if they're, are you gonna test them every day? You're almost gonna have to, because what happens if they're in the hotel and one of the hotel workers is sick because they've been going back and forth to home and they encounter it, and then they give it to a player, and then all of a sudden that team's infected. Do they all have to quarantine then? And what there's so many logistical measures. What if there's a rash of injuries in a team where there's no minor league system going right now? Where are you going to get those players to replace the guys that get hurt?
Well, I mean, well, first of all, I think the plan is, unless I misunderstood, is essentially they're bringing all their people in, so they're bringing in chefs and people to run things, and so you wouldn't have outside influence. But saying that, I just can't imagine a hotel is going to allow you to come in and take over their building, so there has to be someone. But yeah, that's exactly what I'm talking about, essentially. And or if you're a star NHL player and your best friend from high school sends you a note and says, "Hey, I'm here. I'm going overseas. I'm in the military. Can you sneak out and see me for a couple hours?" Like those kind of things, I can just see kind of happening. And the testing is the other issue. I mean, suppose one of them sneaks out, somebody gets sick, and then what do we do then? Does that team forfeit? Or do we quarantine both teams? Do they delay? Where do we go? I think this is all good intentions, and I think we all want to see hockey, and I know they're going to try to make it safe, but I just don't know if it's the right thing to do. And I hope I'm wrong. I hope they've got it all figured out. But boy, I think if I was king and I got to do it, I think I'd have a hard time pushing the button on resumption until we had a vaccine, or at least we had an effective treatment regimen, but probably a vaccine.
I did see, I think it was Ohio State's athletic director talking about college football and saying he just can't see them playing until there's a vaccine, because you can't gather all those people together and risk, an outbreak. And
especially football, to me, where there's collision on every play, and there's scrapes and bruises, entry into your body. There are just too many more ways to do it because of all that, and there's more players in a dressing room in football, so it's all of that. But who knows? I mean, we're gonna have to see this play out, and you know what? Maybe the conditions themselves will dictate that this can't happen. I mean, as much as they're talking about trying to open up the economy and everything, what if we get to May 1st and we still, we've sort of flattened the curve a little bit, but we're still losing people every day. I just don't see that you could do that. And to be honest with you, I really respect the governors, Republican and Democrat, who have just seemed to kind of be on top of this. You see them around. The governor of California said, "That's great. You guys want to start sports, but you're not starting in my state till after Thanksgiving." And good for him, because what he cares about is making it as safe as possible for Californians. And and that's what now it's turned out from the NHL. They probably were not going to have it. Now probably they are not going to have any playoff teams in California, but that could obviously impact them next year as well.
And I think the other issue is if you start testing the players and you're not testing everyday folks, what kind of bad PR is that going to get you? If that whole elitist thing, because you're famous, so you're more important than I am. Someone who's sick and can't get a test, but so these hockey players are going to get tested every day to make sure they're not sick.
Well, I had an editor, and every time you'd be in a situation where you were talking about sourcing of a story or whether or not you should use this fact, whether or not you're able to prove this and all that kind of thing, he'd always say to me, if you have to think about it, you probably shouldn't do it. And I think that's what I think about in this. If we really have to think about whether we should do it, we probably shouldn't.
Yeah.
So anyway, on that note, we appreciate you for tuning in and listening and watching us. And we'll be back later in the week for another edition of HockeyDebates.com podcast. I'm Kevin Allen. He's Bob Duff.
Have a great day, everybody. We'll see you on Thursday.